Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie de Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College, the college is situated on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge their stewardship of the land and are grateful for the opportunity to be discussing books. This is a series that's called Massey Loves to Read, and we're delighted to be celebrating good books. This one today is The Art of Sharing by Mary Janigan. And to animate our discussion, I am so happy and so delighted to welcome Steve Paikin, who's going to be moderating this discussion about this important book. Steve is, as you know, now is a member of the Quadrangle Society of Massey College, well-known journalist, and has been animating these good discussions for quite a while. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Nathalie, c'était mon plaisir. Bienvenue. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in this discussion about a book. Well, what do we describe this book as? It's a very typical, nerdy Mary Janigan book that tries to explain some of the more complicated federal provincial programs that really make this country tick, or at least have for the past 6 decades. Mary, that's a compliment, just so you know. We love nerdy policy discussions, both on TVO and at Massey College. So let's dive in. This book is, I guess, just for those who really don't know the ABCs of it, it's about the equalization program that came into being more than 6 decades ago, and you have referred to it as vital to the survival of Canada as a nation and part of the glue that holds the country together. So let's start there. What is it exactly?
It's a transfer from the federal government to the poorer provinces. It allows them to provide reasonably comparable services for reasonably comparable levels of taxation. And no one pays attention to it. And yet it's vitally important. If you have unequal provinces, you have huge problems, huge stresses on national unity. It's fascinated me for years.
And when Prime Minister Louis Saint-Laurent brought this program in, his Liberal government back in 1957, how much support was there in the country for making it happen?
Nobody paid much attention to what Louis Saint-Laurent accomplished, except the people who were opposed to it. So Saint-Laurent knew he had done something extraordinary based on decades of experience in Ottawa with royal commissions, but he didn't really sell it. Meanwhile, Ontario, Conservative Premier Leslie Frost thought that the feds were giving too much money to the poorer provinces. So he opposed it. He wanted a greater return of the taxes they collected from Ontario. And the poorer Atlantic provinces, they didn't think they were getting enough, so they opposed it. So in the subsequent election, Diefenbaker, 1957, Diefenbaker won a minority government, and Saint-Laurent was crushed. It was one of his greatest federal provincial accomplishments, and all he got was blame. But he did something remarkable.
Do other countries around the world have similar equalization programs that are kind of the glue that keeps them together?
What I discovered in researching this book was that every major modern federation has an equalization program of some kind, except the United States. Beland and Lecours have theorized that the Americans have not developed an equalization program because they haven't had a major territorial threat in the 20th century, although I'm not sure what's going on in the 21st. Also, Americans tend to shy away from what they regard as socialist programs. The difficulty is that we can see the results. The spending per person on education in the richer states is so much higher than the spending per person in the poorer states. And the educational outcomes reflect that. It's a great shame.
Well, let's put it in a Canadian context here, just to give the people watching this some sense of how this works. We're talking about $20 billion a year. That's a heck of a lot of money. And I wonder how much different things are today, all these years after the fact. We're talking more than 60 years later. You said back then it was Ontario that was not happy because they were giving up too much. The Maritimes weren't happy, they were getting too little. How much has changed in the intervening 63 years?
That's a good question. What has changed is that, first of all, getting equalization allowed the poorer provinces to participate in national social programs. That was a huge deal. They could join hospital care, they could join Medicare eventually, they could participate in post-secondary education programs, they had funds. So most provinces, the people in every province actually support it in polls. Most provinces generally don't pay much attention to it. There has been one outlier, which is Alberta, which has fiercely criticized the program, and in particular, the amount of money that goes to Quebec. Obviously, Quebec gets a lot because it has a lot more people, but it's not the province that gets the highest per capita payments. What's changed is almost every province now is on board. Everyone from time to time squawks about the amount they're getting or not getting, but no one has ever challenged the existence of the program until Alberta came along and started threatening having a referendum on its very existence, which of course would have no effect, but it's unfortunate.
Well, I read in your book that the current Alberta Premier Jason Kenney doesn't like the equalization program right now because he sees his province being in a recession, and he sees positive growth rates in the province of Quebec, at least certainly pre-COVID. And he says this doesn't make any sense that we're sending money to Ottawa to give to Quebec when our economy is going in the toilet and they're doing just fine and giving their citizens tax cuts. Does he have a point?
Yes. One of the points about equalization, that it's a nation building program, but it's also a deeply pragmatic program. You can keep the program, but change the formula. You can change the way it's paid out. It doesn't require trashing it to change it. Just recently, in late November, the feds changed the Fiscal Stabilization program, which pays money to Alberta. They want more still, but they were at least somewhat responsive to what Alberta's been saying, that it doesn't get equalization because it has the highest per capita fiscal capacity in the country. But also, the way that equalization is calculated, it takes account of what was happening 3, 4, 5 years ago, not what's happened now. So it's no wonder that Alberta is upset. Surely today we could take faster snapshots of what's going on, and perhaps, for all I know, Alberta will qualify for equalization the next time around. I think it's an incredibly important point to keep on top of. Pay attention to the formula, don't trash the program.
I wonder if another reason Alberta might be upset is that the current federal government in 2018, I gather, as I read in your book, decided to take the existing agreement and extend it for another 5 years rather than renegotiate it, which I gather some of the provinces thought not only ought to be done, but that the feds would do. Why did they just extend and freeze as opposed to reopen and renegotiate?
They outsmarted themselves. I thought that was wrong when I heard about it. They knew an election was coming in 2019. So, and because although they should consult with the provinces, they can set the way the formula works. So they just unilaterally extended it to avoid trouble in an election year. And that was, I believe, not the way to go, because it left open all these criticisms about the formula and how it's working. If I were a finance minister, I would never stop watching equalization and how it's working. They did change stabilization to make Alberta a little bit happier, but they should have gone back and fiddled with the formula more to change a number of things. That the timing, as I said, perhaps they should do more with stabilization. Perhaps Alberta itself could bring in a sales tax, because when they calculate the formula, they assume that Alberta has a sales tax. It's a tough game, but it's worth pursuing.
So the glue that's supposed to be keeping our country together is not quite as sticky as it needs to be right now.
That's correct. You're quite right. It's one of the things that I learned by writing the book. I went back to pre-Confederation and I looked at all of the discussions that had gone on about trying to bring the poorer provinces to some level of equity with the richer provinces. And those battles were ferocious. And there were times in the Maritimes in the 1920s, there was a secessionist movement. The prairie provinces were very upset. When finally equalization came along, it brought some rough peace to the Federation. But you cannot take your eyes off it, and you cannot forget that it's, in addition to being a moral act of sharing, it is a bargain between the provinces, pragmatic and adjustable.
Well, as long as you've gone back in time, let me stay back there. And I want to ask you about the description you use of equalization as a legacy from those who came home from World War II. What do you mean by that?
Yes. In World War II, there had been pressure before the war to introduce social programs. And during the war, Mackenzie King, amongst others, talked about social programs, social security, that would come as a reward for winning the war. So by the time the veterans got home, there were a lot of groups, veterans groups, trade unions, women's groups, who were pressing for some of these social programs to come into effect. During the war, Mackenzie King had brought in unemployment insurance and family allowances, but those were federal transfers to people. They didn't bring social programs, which the provinces ran, to the people. Those people began to press very hard. The NDP was gaining in popularity. Mackenzie King went as far as his cautious little soul would go. And by the time we got into the 1950s, we had some prosperity. We had people buying consumer goods and refrigerators that defrosted themselves, had huge televisions, but if they got sick, it was a calamity unless they had some form of private insurance. So they pushed, and Saint Laurent knew it. He acknowledged when he brought in equalization, when he first spoke to the provinces, that he knew that Canadians were getting very, very impatient to get the good life they had been promised in wartime, and they hadn't got it yet. It was, after all, the war ended in 1945. He brought it in, he introduced it in 1956, and it took effect in 57. It took that long to get hospital care operating. And a lot of people were quite desperate for it.
Just before I bring our two other friends into the discussion as well, as you think about the significant building blocks that make the Canada of today, where on that list would you put equalization payments?
Well, I'm crazy. I think it's very, very, very important. It funds Medicare. It funds the social programs we like. No one pays attention to it. They should. And they should watch what their politicians are doing and saying about it. But I think it's vital. I think it's the primary building block. And I've been saying this for quite some time, and I still feel it so strongly.
Mary, I won't say you're crazy. I will say you're a little bit nerdy for public policy, but let's not say crazy. Okay, let's get some reaction to your book and to the ideas that you have advanced therein. André Lecours is a professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. Bon après-midi, André. Comment allez-vous aujourd'hui?
Ça va très bien, vous?
Pas pire, monsieur, pas pire. Okay, let me get you to weigh in. You've heard what Mary has had to say. The microphone is yours now.
I mean, I think Mary's right. Equalization is central. It's misunderstood, and perhaps most importantly, the misunderstandings around equalization have meant, I would say, almost a perversion of the debate around it. You know, it's a controversial program. I think it's always going to be a little bit controversial because, you know, it's a zero-sum game to a large extent, right? What a province gets is what another province loses. So it's hard to get, you know, consensus on a program like equalization. Although, as Mary said, there's clear support for equalization in each and every Canadian province. Opposition is the highest in Alberta, but it's around 25 to 30%. The big Confederation of Tomorrow survey. So there's large support for equalization in the country. But opposition, when you look at opposition to equalization in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, it's been rising. Why? I think because politicians and commentators have criticized equalization, I would argue, unfairly. And I think that's Mary's book comes in, right? Mary explains why we have equalization. And we have equalization because we have a country where there are significant territorial economic discrepancies on natural resources, for example. Some provinces have oil, others don't. That's usually consequential. So we have these discrepancies, and equalization, I think, brings about ideas of equity and equality in our federation, right?
Let me
the
jump
idea
into
of
the
provincial
question here
autonomy.
for a second,
Yes.
if I can. André,
Yeah.
I suspect people who get a check from the federal government for whatever, family allowance check, a social security check, they understand the role the government plays in their lives when they receive that check. The people of Canada individually from their governments don't receive an equalization check. I wonder if because of that, they really don't know what it is, what it does, what its mission is, and as a result, maybe there's not as much support for it as you think there ought to be.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And the picture of a Canada without equalization, as Mary suggested, I think it's absolutely right on. It is the picture of a country where residents of New Brunswick would not have access to a healthcare system and an education system as good as residents of Ontario or British Columbia. In a way, we would be more like the United States, right? So I think equalization is anchored in some of the fundamental principles of Canada as a political and as a social union as well, right? So I think that's what needs to be appreciated. And that's one of the reasons why equalization is actually enshrined in our Constitution. Its principles and the commitment of the Government of Canada to make equalization payment is written into our Constitution from the 1982 Constitution Act. And I think that symbolizes the importance that it has, for both kind of building Canadian solidarity, redistribution, and identity, but also, like you said, Steve, for the very practical purpose of ensuring that all Canadians have access to quality public services at reasonable levels of taxation.
Well, I noted in Mary's book that if you're the Minister of Finance in the province of New Brunswick, fully 20% of your budget is equalization money. You are up the creek without a paddle if you suddenly find that 20% of your budget revenue disappears. But of course, it comes because there are other wealthier provinces and taxpayers in the country who pay into that pot and who make this federation tick in that regard. Do you think there's anything that any governments or any political leaders in this country ought to be doing to make the citizens of this country understand, number one, what equalization is and the important role it plays in keeping Confederation strong as it is?
I think politicians should avoid making equalization a collateral damage as they fight over issues. And I'm thinking here of oil pipelines, right? The Alberta and the Saskatchewan governments support oil pipeline development because it would help the economy. Alberta's oil right now is dependent upon the Canadian market and the American markets, and the Alberta government wants to expand its market to Europe and Asia. Fair enough. Of course, some provinces oppose oil pipeline developments because it has to go through their territory, it represents environmental dangers, and so on and so forth. And, you know, the discourse of Premier Kenney, for example, to say, okay, other provinces don't want to help us develop our economy by supporting the development of oil pipeline, maybe we will withdraw from equalization, which, as Mary said, is not something that a province can do. But this type of discourse, you see Steve saying, right, you won't give us oil pipelines, then, you know, maybe we'll do something with equalization. You know, I think is not healthy because, you know, it's not saying there's a problem with equalization, although, to be fair, Alberta politicians say that too. But to say that, you know, here, some of our provincial counterparts won't give us that, therefore we won't give them equalization. First of all, it's a perversion of how the program works. And then it's kind of shifting blame to a program that really doesn't bear that particular responsibility of building or not building pipelines. So that would be the first step, I think, is to really kind of measure one's discourse and try to, you know, it's okay to discuss equalization, but let's discuss equalization then. Let's not, you know, say that equalization is to blame for, you know, something that doesn't happen in the economic development of the country.
Understood. I see Joe Biden's not much of a fan of Keystone XL either. He came out now and said that's not going to happen, and he's not even president yet. Anyway, let's move on. Let's bring Nathalie Desrosiers into our conversation here. She's the principal at Massey College, a constitutional scholar. Nathalie, where would you like to take our conversation on equalization at this point as you weigh in on Mary's thesis?
Well, first of all, I want to say the reason why Mary's book is important is because not only does it spell out exactly why we need to continue to have equalization, how nerdy as it is, but how it is essential to a federal structure. It's not only Canada that has some ways of which recognizing that it's important to equalize revenues and abilities of different government to deliver services. If you don't have equalization and you have New Brunswick that's unable to offer good education services, you undermine the ability of mobility rights. You know, why would I hire someone from New Brunswick if their education system is not comparable to someone that I can hire from Ontario or from Quebec or so on? So that is linked, you know, so there's a link between a quality of education that makes the mobility of the workforce important or feasible. The second part, I think, of the book, that it could change. It says it's a program that is neutral. That is, it's not negotiated because I like this province, I like this government, I don't like this government. It's a formula. So it has some form of objectivity. You can change the formula, but in essence, it has tried to remove politics from this redistribution, which is essential. And what I really like about the book also is because it displays the evolution of the idea. You know, it's almost kind of a way in which we figure out how did we come up with what we have now. And I think it's very important for Canadians to reflect a little bit of how do we get to where we are now? So that's an important aspect. I really like that. I really like, in a deliberative democracy, you know, that ideas float and get debated, and then they move on, and then there's a royal commission that kind of takes it one way, and then the governments are hashing it out. So just on that sort of sociological view of how do we get to have progress, I think it's important. As André said, now since 1982, it is in our Constitution, Section 36 of the Constitution Act of 1982 does say that, and I quote, that provincial governments and the federal governments are committed to promoting equal opportunities for the well-being of Canadians, furthering economic development, and providing essential public services of reasonable quality to all Canadians. So essentially, it has spelled out a little bit the objectives of the program, which is we're in this together, and it's the right way to say it. And I think it's normal for some governments to sometimes feel uncomfortable with the formula and try to, make political things. But you have to remember that your situation could change over time. Alberta was not, it could be in a positions where later on it might need equalization more if indeed its economy continues to be in trouble or has to change or is in transition and so on. So Saskatchewan was not always a wealthy province. So you don't know, and this is the bargain of Confederation, is you're committed to probably a vision where there will be exchange, there will be unfairness, but you have to be committed to some form of sharing.
I think I remember 3 decades ago. Now my memory's a little scratchy here, but I think Brian Mulroney was the prime minister, and I think Roy Romanow was the premier of Saskatchewan, and there were conversations between the two of them where Saskatchewan was going to have trouble literally servicing its debt, and whether the feds would have to come in and help them out because they were so poor. No one's having those conversations about Saskatchewan anymore. But I do want to follow up on something you just said. But before I do that, we should let everybody know who's watching this that we are happy to take your questions if you have them. I presume there's a function on the screen there somewhere where you can type in your questions, and a few minutes down the road, we'll happily put those questions to our guests. But Nathalie, I do want to follow up with you on this one thing. It wasn't that long ago that you were a politician at Queen's Park. And it was probably during a time, Ontario in the last 10 years or so has really flipped back and forth between being a have and a have-not province. And I wonder how much chatter did you hear when you were at Queen's Park from politicians who were saying to themselves, if not for these damned equalization payments that we have to send to the federal government for other provinces, our own fiscal bottom line would be a lot better off. Did you hear much of that?
Well, I don't think it's a well-known program enough for people to actually think of it this way. And the idea that if you stop sending money, and therefore you would have New Brunswick or another poor province as being unable to deliver minimum services. I mean, that's part of it. It's just one aspect of the federal redistribution infrastructure. It has the capacity to, it's essential to actually having provincial governments do it. What's important here is that it allows governments to deliver provincial services. It's not about, and if not, then what's the point of having a federation where you have the federal government and the provinces having some discretion to do whatever they think their citizens need, if every time New Brunswick or another poorer provinces needs to do anything, it has to ask permission, ask to go in and get some special grant and so on. It has depleted its ability to respond to its citizenry. So there's democratic arguments to support it. There is national arguments to support it, and there are, as I say, I think strong economic argument to, particularly after COVID, we will know that you cannot have, we are as vulnerable as the weakest health care system anywhere in the world, and particularly in Canada. So I think that argument of the mobility requires minimum standards, and that's part of the solution is to continue to have an equalization program.
Okay, let's open up our conversation here, and in doing so, I'll ask Mary to start us off. Is there anything you've heard from either of your two friends here that you would like to follow up on before I ask some more questions?
Could I clarify one thing, please?
Please.
Equalization is funded by money from all taxpayers. It goes to Ottawa. The governments themselves do not contribute. Nathalie referred to that obliquely, but it's every taxpayer in Canada. And one of the worst things that's been happening in Alberta, sadly, is that Jason Kennedy has been talking about Alberta sending the money to Ottawa, but it's not the provincial government. And that is really important. It causes, I think it's why André has referenced the fact that the popularity of equalization is declining in Alberta because of misinformation that's being given.
There's a demonization of the program, you see.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes, and it shouldn't be.
Could you take us back as well, Mary, to the role Australia played in all of this? Because I know throughout your book, as you go all the way through, and we're going back many, many decades right now, things happened in Australia that our people were on top of, and somehow they played a big role in having this happen. What was that?
That was the surprise for me. I knew that Australia had provided a model. What I didn't know is, I didn't know the interrelationship between the federal Australian government and the Canadian government starting in the 1920s. I mean, they've been close even before. When Australia was devising its constitution, it looked at both the federal Canadian constitution and the American one. But in the 20s, things really got interesting because in both countries, states were starting to complain about the money they were getting from the central government. So through research, I pulled up all the royal commissions that had gone on in the 20s and the parliamentary committees and went through them. And lo and behold, they were starting to reference each other. There was a very important one in Canada that the Australians seized, the Royal Commission on Maritime Problems, that's the wrong word. But the Royal Commission on how the Maritimes were operating did several things. It said the federal government was not responsible for Australia's, or for the provincial problems that were going on. In other words, they didn't have to pay just because of the very active federation. And in Australia, royal commissions were quoting that line everywhere, that among many other things. Everywhere I looked, it was Australia. And the book, someone who was a former deputy minister of finance read the book over Christmas and said, yes, this is exactly right. We still always reference Australia. We look at how it's operating, how it's dealing, and how it handles inequality. And André has dealt a lot with that too, on how Australia has handled things with the Commonwealth Grants Commission.
André, you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I mean, Mary's right. The comparison between Canada and Australia has always been there. There's been, as Mary shows in her book, very important influences, mutual influences, but in particular, Australians came here and presented their model. And, you know, I guess what I want to emphasize that we also chose to forego some elements of the Australian model, which, as Mary said, includes an arm's length agency to make decisions on equalization. That's a model that I personally like because I think it would help to, you know, help depoliticize equalization even more. To have an agency of independent appointed experts to make recommendations on both payments and the structure of the formula. But our politicians have chosen not to go in that direction. Probably the provincial governments, because they feel they can they feel they can leverage the federal government on equalization. The federal government, I think, because, well, Canada is a much more decentralized federation than Australia, and equalization is one of the few fundamental levers that the federal government can exercise, like countrywide. So far we have the federal government being solely and completely in charge of decisions on equalization.
Nathalie, you'd have to confess that it's really, I mean, given the history of federal-provincial relations in this country, it would be unusual for provincial premiers to give up the hammer that fighting about equalization represents as they try to get more out of the federal government. Fair to say?
Well, there's a lot that you can fight the federal government about. You know, I think I just want to say equalization is just one tool of redistribution. I mean, the federal government can have what we call the spending power. It can decide to do bigger things and distribute the money in different ways. So I think it's an important tool because it has a sense in which it is premised on the delivery of equivalent program at the provincial levels, but it does not prevent the federal government from doing other things that it might want to do. I think one aspect that's interesting in looking at Australia, which came up when you read the book of Mary, you say, wow, they're obsessed with each other. You know, they're always kind of referring to each other. The fundamental, every so often you can see that one of the difficulty in looking at Australia, and even in constitutional law, we look at the division of powers and so on, is they did not have the same cultural differences that we have in Canada. Like they don't have a Quebec that has a view of its that is very jealous of its powers in a way that's historically divine and so on. So I think that's a significant differences, but it's still very useful. I mean, when you look at form of federations, when you look at federations around the world, we have a lot to learn about what are the tools that exist, because there will always be a weaker partner. It may change over time, but there was at one point in time, there will always be one of the partners who's slightly less well off. It's a comparative exercise. So those tools that exist, and that's what I liked about the book. It's a little bit about looking at what existed, how did the ideas come about, why did we choose to go this way, what were the options. So I think it's very important for us to know about this heritage, intellectual
Mary, you
heritage.
come back on that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Nathalie, first. But secondly, what surprised me was how it had to be created at a certain point. Saint Laurent and Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis had gotten into a series of financial standoffs, and then they got into a war of words, which was even more damaging, arguably. Who was the better Canadian? Was Quebec a province like the others? Saint Laurent knew he had to diffuse this, and Quebec had refused. During wartime, Ottawa had collected 3 principal taxes for all provinces. When the war ended, Quebec would not allow Ottawa to collect its taxes. So it was losing compensatory grants, and that was amounting to quite a lot of money by the time you got to the mid-1950s. Saint Laurent knew he had to do something, and he did. He gave the compensatory grants to every province, whether or not Ottawa collected its taxes. And there were surprising objections to that. Tommy Douglas didn't want the provinces that wouldn't allow Ottawa to collect its taxes to get the grant money. He wanted Ottawa to have large pools of cash for Keynesian purposes.
Mm-hmm.
It was an inspired deed by Saint Laurent, and it came out of a national unity crisis.
When you think about today and this My question is this. I understand that Albertans right now, maybe because the Premier of Alberta has ginned them up a lot over how he sees his province being ripped off. That's his words, not mine. But I wonder whether you think that see, my hunch is most Canadians have never heard of equalization. They don't know about it. If you walk down the street today and you stop the first 100 people, they're not like Mary Janigan reading Australian Hansard at 2:00 in the morning and being very excited about committee discussions. They don't know anything about it. If 3 people out of 100 that you stopped on the street knew what equalization was on Yonge Street in downtown Toronto, I'd be shocked. So how do you mobilize support for a national program that's the glue that keeps the country together when I'm guessing 95% of the people don't know it exists?
Well, you may not need to. Go ahead, Mary. Yeah.
No, please, Nathalie. You were a politician.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of complicated tools that we have, and that's part of, sometimes, you want to be transparent, which means that all the time, if a question is asked, you have the ability to answer, and you want to have a scholarship that continues to push these ideas and gets the people that should know to know well. But there's a lot of things that we don't know because we need to have trust. Part of the democracy requires a little bit of trust in the exercise by the bureaucracy, in the way in which government works. And that's what, when we worry about democracy or we worry about countries falling apart, is we worry about the fact that if trust goes down the tube, then, or the toilet, then they won't be that glue. Then there won't be any way of recovering that glue. We cannot be experts on everything. We cannot, I mean, that's part of representation democracy, is I'm not going to spend the time to read everything that I should know about economic development in so-and-so, or the crisis and how to protect birds in some places, or how to, I won't have the time. I have other things to do. So I trust and I vote for generally people that present a clear picture, that I think are intellectually honest about where they want to go, that have a bit of a vision. And I think that's probably why some nerdy things like equalization continue to be important, but they don't need to be in the public eye all the time.
But we're pretty low on trust right now. I think that's the right. The public's trust of its institutions and its longstanding programs is, well, it might be at an all-time low. Mary, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. Number one, I think the superb work that's being done in universities to look at things like equalization. André and Daniel Béland have done amazing papers looking at equalization in other places and other countries, and looking at Canadian equalization. And I think those papers can be accessed by policy people in ministers' offices to offer advice. That is important. Trust may be low, but it's being eroded even more when provinces keep implying that they're responsible, their governments are sending the money to Ottawa to be redistributed. I think it was sociologist Raymond Breton who said the definition of a nation is the geographic area over which the people are prepared to share. And as long as we can keep that idea of sharing, to keep alive the nation, we're going to get through this. I think the pandemic, in a way, has pulled us a bit more together. I hope. Anyway, but maybe I'm being an idealist.
Well, let me play devil's advocate and say, André, as long as everybody thinks they're getting an equal shot at the vaccine, maybe this notion of trust, maybe this notion of competence and belief in institutions can persist. Except that if you look at the actual empirical provable facts, there are some provinces that are getting more doses than others. There are provinces that are getting it faster than others. And if we can use that as a jumping off point to talk about equalization, if you don't have that trust in the program or the knowledge that the program exists, I wonder whether it's in risk of jeopardy. What do you think?
Well, I think, the most dangerous is the mischaracterization of equalization by a lot of people who know that they're mischaracterizing the program, which is, disappointing, right? Like we said earlier, saying that Alberta sends money straight to Quebec. Well, it's not that. So the program should be described as it actually works. I think that's the number one responsibility. Now, I think the program itself is not in jeopardy. It's constitutionally protected. The provinces really cannot change the program. It can pressure the federal government to do so, but it can't certainly abolish the program or even change it against the wishes of the federal government. Now, this being said, it's okay to have debates about equalization, and I think COVID will generate a debate because COVID, from a territorial economic perspective, has actually shrunk disparities in Canada. Right? It has shrunk disparities because the Alberta economy is really struggling. So the pool of equalization money now, one could argue, is much more significant relative to the discrepancies than it's ever been. So we will have critics who will say, well, there's just too much money there. Disparities are shrinking. So I think the debate we need to have, I guess, is how much do we want to redistribute in the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's valid points to say, look, maybe we should redistribute less, and there's valid points to say maybe we should redistribute more. And it's about and of course we know that provinces who think who are recipient of equalization or who think they're going to be recipient, they're going to want more redistribution. And provinces who are not recipient or who think they're not going to be recipient, they're going to want less. We know a bit what the positions are going to be. And it's really up to the federal government to make the ultimate decision. But, it's reasonable to have debates on equalization if it's well characterized. And there are substantive issues. As I said, COVID is shrinking disparities and the equalization pool is remaining as is. Is that what we want? It could be, but it may not be. And that it's reasonable to have a discussion on that.
Let me check in with our technical producer, Matthew, here, who says, yes, indeed, we do have some questions coming in from those who are watching. The first one is from Donna Siegel, who may be well known to people who are watching this right now. Donna's a longtime public servant and one of the biggest brains we've got in this country. In terms of economic recovery post-COVID, are there any changes that Mary or André would suggest for the essential structure or formula of equalization? Apropos to our last discussion. Mary, you want to chime in?
Well, André will know more about this than I do, but equalization right now is increasing at 3% per year automatically. It's no longer simply adjusted by the formula. It goes up automatically. So you have every province competing to get a share of that new money every year. It's kind of crazy, and they should change it, and they might have changed it in 2019 if they hadn't rushed through approving or just keeping the formula from the last 5 years in place. It's something I would take care of right away. André?
Equalization is not an obvious tool for dealing with post-COVID economic pain because, again, it's relative, right? So it basically brings provinces that are below an average fiscal capacity up to that fiscal capacity. So it will always only provide payments to some provinces, to those that are below the average national fiscal capacity. So, I don't think you want to boost the total equalization envelope too much, because then provinces like Alberta, who are struggling economically but are still above the average fiscal capacity, get no equalization. And of course, politically, and I think for national unity, it's a dangerous proposition. So probably boosting the equalization amount is not. You don't want to do post-COVID economic recovery through equalization, I don't think.
Can I just confirm, because I'm not, it does change from time to time. Which are the have and which are the have-not provinces in our country today? Does anybody know for sure?
British Columbia is have, Alberta's have, Saskatchewan's have, and Ontario has gone back to being have. But it just slid into being have. And sometimes over the decades, the feds changed the formula to make sure that provinces cannot be have. Have not, even though they would like to have been. Ontario, for a while in the late 70s, would have been a have-not, but they changed the formula. And Alberta, they started adding resource revenues in the 60s to ensure that Alberta could not keep receiving equalization because the formula was not taking account of resource revenues. And of course, Alberta by then was doing very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ontario just not that long ago slipped into have-not status. Did they change the definition to get us back into have?
No, they started to recover.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know.
They stuck to the formula for that. And the thing about equalization is it's the feds cannot tell the provinces how to spend the money. It's non-conditional. You don't even really apply. And this is what makes it so perfect, because initially when it was started, I don't believe Quebec would have even thought of applying. Indeed, there were references at FedProv conferences that Quebec didn't realize it was going to get equalization. I don't think that's true. I think it was a position of pride. But the non-conditionality of it makes it perfect for a Canadian federation that is really decentralized. In my mind, it's important. You can't use it truly. André is right for a total post-COVID recovery program because we'd have people in the streets, but it's part of the recovery for sure.
Nathalie, you look like you want it in there.
Well, I just wanted to say again, it's not the only tool that we have to accomplish recovery goals. I mean, the federal government could decide to have a large, with conditions, new program where, that as they have done that before, where they establish some conditions so that you get the grant only if you get if you comply with the conditions. That's the Canada Health Plan, for example. So it does not prevent the federal government to use new tools to do recovery. So I think it was designed to essentially remedy the lack of capacity of some provinces to deliver provincial programs, and equalize that ability. So it's not the only tool, and it should not be the only tool that exists in a federation.
True.
André, when the current freeze lapses, in other words, the current formula, I gather the federal government has put it in place probably, I guess, for another couple of years. When that lapses, what would be your advice to whoever the government of the day is in terms of keeping it the way it is or renegotiating or what?
Well, I guess it depends what objectives you want to attain, right? I mean, if you're looking for, as I said before, if you're looking for more redistribution or solid redistribution, I mean, you pretty much keep it as is. Now, that will create some political tensions. So if your goal is to quiet those down a little bit, those coming from Alberta in particular, then maybe the federal government wants to reduce the overall pool of equalization money. As I said before, there would be a good substantive argument to do that because disparities have shrunk. And you're saying, okay, we've worked for many years with this kind of ratio between total equalization money and certain disparities. Now these disparities are shrinking, so we should shrink the equalization pool. So it's really, I guess, a matter of what objective will be pursued by the federal government. And And also, again, at the end of the day, how much redistribution do we want? How much redistribution also is healthy for the Canadian Federation, right? We have to take that into account. We might want to be somebody who wants extensive redistribution, but that could come at every price, at the price of heavy intergovernmental conflict, and I'm not sure we want that.
Nathalie, I wanted to ask you, because Mary referenced this earlier, Alberta may have a referendum on this. We know it would be not legally binding, but they may still have a referendum on the public's attitude and appetite for renegotiating the equalization program. If you're the federal government and Alberta comes back with a referendum that says 80% of the people are unhappy, you have to take that seriously.
Well, I think politically you do, for sure. And I think it would be wise to do that. And I think they've already responded. It's not the only tool that there is, and there could be some new tools to appease the issue. I think certainly, I think unless there are Alberta wants a constitutional amendment, it's not going to be able to do anything about it. And the long road of constitutional amendment would put them being fairly isolated, I think, on this issue. I want to go back to something that André said, that if indeed disparities have decreased between provinces, that's a good thing. That means that indeed the purpose of the program has delivered in some way, because you always wanted to create the sense of within different provinces that they could be their own agents of economic development. So the fact that New Brunswick has thought about developing some centers to develop some of its potential, and therefore maybe the disparities are not as wide or as big as they used to be, that shows that they had the education system to get them there, and they have the medical care to get themselves there. So there's a way in which it's a virtuous circle as opposed to a vicious circle if you redistribute to the extent that you're not going to create such a have-nots provinces that they're unable to get themselves at a minimum standard that would be acceptable to Canadians. Yeah.
Okay. We have time left for one more question, and I'm going to put it to Mary. Oh, here we go. Okay. I'm going to have time for two more questions. One here from Peter Raymond, who's one of this country's finest documentary producers, and then I'll throw the last one in once we finish with Peter's. Are the territories part of the equalization program? That's a good question. Mary, do we know, are the territories in or just the provinces?
No, there are territorial financing programs too that are comparable to equalization and that work with the territorial governments. So they actually, I believe they receive more cash than the provinces get in terms of that formula, because they have harder times right now. But yes, they're taken care of properly, or at least they wouldn't say properly, all of them, but they are specially included with territorial financing agreements.
Understood. All right. I think a deeply nerdy policy discussion, the likes of which we have just had, requires that we conclude with a very romantic question. So to that end, and Mary, I'm going to quote right out of your book here. You didn't think this was a romantic novel that you've written here, but there's a very romantic line in here that I want to ask you about, because in the acknowledgments of your book, you write about your husband, Tom Kieran's, that his belief in me has never flagged, even as I lost faith in myself. What is that a reference to?
I left journalism to go back to school. I got a master's, and that paper became a book. And then I went back and I got my doctorate. And it was a long haul, and it's really hard to live with someone who keeps speaking about transfer payments and who endlessly talk about equalization. This time I had to figure out whether or not the social transfer and the health transfer were per capita, or whether or not there was still some equalizing of tax points, which are now forgotten. He was very, very patient and very kind. At one point in Tasmania, I dragged him into the provincial parliament and asked if I could speak to the archivists. I had no appointment. He's trudged along through a fair amount. He's wonderful. And he's a policy person, but he's sick of equalization.
You know what? I didn't know where the answer to that question was going to go, but I thought I'm going to ask it just in case. And that is a lovely, delightful answer. OK, so let's do a couple of things here. Nathalie Desrosiers, merci beaucoup pour votre participation d'après-midi. André Lecours from University of Ottawa, thank you so much for your participation as well. We should show the book. It's called The Art of Sharing, The Richer versus the Poorer Provinces Since Confederation. And our star of our show here, our guest, has been Mary Janigan, who likes to stay up late at night reading Hansard from Tasmania. Tom must be a very patient person. This was a delight. Not at all, Mary. Thank you very much for doing this. And to our audience watching, we thank you for joining as well. And until next time, so long from the third floor of the house. In my attic, where I'm spending way too much time since this pandemic hit, but we get to stay on the air by doing this. Anyways, good night, everybody.